Welcome to the Ducks Unlimited podcast, the only podcast about all things waterfowl. From hunting insights to science-based discussions about ducks, geese, and issues affecting waterfowl and wetlands conservation in North America, we bring the resource to you. The DU Podcast with your host, Dr. Mike Brazier.
We're about to wrap up season 4, our summer season. And for this final episode of this particular season, we wanted to reach back out to one of our longtime guests, one of our most popular guests, and one of our most frequent guests, Dr. Scott Stevens, Director of Regional Operations for Ducks Unlimited Canada up in the Prairies and Boreal. Scott, welcome back to the podcast.
Pleased to be with you again, Mike.
We've had a lot to discuss here over the summer. It's certainly an interesting year on a number of fronts, whether we want to talk about the continuing effects of the coronavirus, the developing drought across the prairies. Those have been the two things that have dominated a lot of our discussion, some of the ramifications of those developments and what they mean for data collection and harvest regulations, breeding habitat conditions. That's what has been on the mind of a lot of us within the waterfowl management field here over the past few months, and it continues to be and will be over the next few months and perhaps even into the next year. So we wanted to reconnect and speak with someone that's spent the summer up there in the prairies. That is I guess that's sort of the epicenter where some of the concern is regarding the drought, certainly, and so. That's one of the things that we'll talk about here and get you to chime in on. But also, I just wanted to, on a personal note, check in and see how things have been going for you this summer.
I appreciate the chance to check in. Maybe what's noteworthy today is I was sitting here on a call earlier and we got a little thunderstorm move through and it rained pretty good here, which is the first dose of rain that we've probably had in over a month. So, short news is remains dry. My grass in my front yard is dead and brown. Maybe it'll green up a little bit based on that dose of precipitation. But it remains dry across much of the Canadian prairies. So conditions have not improved probably since we visited last time.
So with that dry weather and your yard turning brown, does that mean you have additional time to do things other than mowing your grass? What about your garden? How are things going around the house there? How does that all affect what Scott Stevens does?
Yeah, good question. So I'll admit I don't mind when I don't have to spend time mowing the grass. Mowing the grass is kind of time wasted in my book. So the garden is going okay. I supplement. It gets rain every morning at about 6:30 or 7 a.m. provided by me. So tomato plants and pepper plants are doing okay. But yeah, since I'm not cutting the grass, this past weekend I spent a day and a half fishing with a friend. And so in this part of the world, that means usually trying to catch some walleye. We were successful in that on Saturday. So I've got a few walleye fillets in the freezer that will become supper sometime this week. So that's what's been on tap here.
I also know that you have been practicing your skills at hornet wrestling. We'll not get too far into that conversation. Although I do appreciate Stacy providing video evidence of what transpired there, and so I am glad that you made it out of that without getting stung. I do have to ask? Did Ulu, your lab, get stung? Is that how we discovered the presence of that hornet nest?
Yeah, she seemed to discover the nest and then we figured that out, and then I came up with a scheme to remove the nest and release it without harming the contents. And it went amazingly according to plan, much to my wife's sort of chagrin, I think.
Yeah. And thanks to the able service of your Yeti bucket too. I have to add that, right?
That's right. The Yeti bucket was definitely involved in the process. So yeah. Multifunction bucket. And thanks for having it handy there. Well,
let's see. We are here mid-July. This is like July 12th, I believe. And that means that we are not too far away from the upcoming waterfowl hunting season. When does it start there for you, Scott? Is it early September?
September 1.
Wow.
Yep.
Wow. Yeah, not long at all. Let that be our transition here to talk about what we might expect, what you might expect there on your hunting exploits across the prairies this year, and then also kind of what we here south of the border should expect. We've had conversations with a number of people there across the prairies to update us on drought conditions. Yourself, Mike Anderson, Mike Tamansky, and Pat Kehoe. So we heard reports a few months ago, and it was really, really dry. You've kind of already alluded to the fact that it continues to be dry. Have you been able to travel west into Saskatchewan or Alberta, any place, or have you been talking with people over there? I know, and the reason I ask is because Pat had taken a trip across the prairies maybe a month or so ago, and he described that it was really dry. It's dry across the board, but he noted some recent precipitation in some of the western provinces there, and he was hopeful that maybe it would continue. Have you done any traveling or had conversations with people that would enable you to kind of give us an update on how things may have changed since then?
Yeah, I've not done any traveling to the west, so I've not seen many areas firsthand, other than a trip that I took early in the spring when I went out to the Minnedosa pothole country here in Manitoba. But I have talked to folks, and yes, we have definitely gotten some precipitation. Alberta has continued to get some precipitation, and probably wetland conditions. If we break them down by the three prairie provinces, Alberta was probably in the best shape. Early on, they had some decent water in sort of central Alberta. They've continued to get some rain. Saskatchewan was spotty, a little bit of water in some of the parkland areas, but dry in the prairies. My assessment would be, I don't think the precipitation we've gotten has changed that much. At this point, we've not got really significant rains like 6 inches at a time or anything like that, which is what it would take to really change wetland conditions at this point in the year. So we've got rain that will, green the grass and help some crops that are out there, but not probably impacting wetland conditions much.
So I guess the take home here is that what was to have happened with waterfowl production this year has already happened. We're not likely to see anything from here to the end of the summer that's going to materially change anything with regard to production across the prairies. I think the consensus is that we should certainly expect some low productivity, maybe even very low productivity out of the prairies this year. And a point worth making and emphasizing here is that when the prairie drought gets a lot of our attention here this year, and rightly so. It's the first time since probably the mid-'80s that we've had a drought of this severity and as widespread as it was. We've talked about precipitation lessening some of the drought in Alberta and maybe a bit in Saskatchewan, but still at the time when it would be most critical for ducks arriving back on the prairies, back in April and May, it was pretty doggone dry across all of the important prairie provinces and states here on the U.S. side. And so that sort of set the table in terms of what to expect for this production year. And so when we think about a prairie drought, I mean, that's the area that's going to drive the highs and lows, the variation in production and waterfowl population change, at least in the mid-continent. And so the point to make here is that the effects of a drought across the prairie are mainly going to be felt in the Mississippi and Central Flyway. We can, as we talk about the Atlantic Flyway, a lot of the birds over there are going to be supported by breeding regions in other areas. And the same thing for the Pacific Flyway. But now there's drought forming in the Pacific Flyway, and that sort of takes on a different picture in itself. And I know that's going to continue to be some of our conversations in the fall. But is that kind of the message, Scott, that with regard to a prairie drought, let's not think about it as having overall, I mean, it's not the end all for waterfowl populations and hunter expectations across North America, right? Is it appropriate to kind of compartmentalize this and think about it in that way?
Yeah, I think so. It's not the end of the world. People will still definitely see ducks. If we have a year where we have low production or even no production, there will still be ducks that fly south. So I think that's good perspective. I think the message that we were trying to deliver is, now is the time of the year when, the bumps in the population usually happen with the breeding season, and there probably won't be much of a bump this year. There'll be a few young birds, not many. And that sort of has implications for, success of folks who are looking to harvest birds, especially at more southern latitudes. I think better seasons tend to happen when we have really good production, lots of young birds in the fall flight. Young birds may be a pretty high proportion of the total number of birds. That will not be the case this year. So, there will still be ducks out there. They will just largely be adult birds who have sort of been through a migration before, have played the game before, and they will be more difficult to fool into coming into your decoys.
The other point to make here, Scott, is that the effects of a prairie drought are going to be felt most strongly for a subset of ducks in North America. There are some that are tied much more closely every year. Even during prairie drought years, there are some species that just have a stronger affinity for breeding in areas outside the prairies. So run through some of those species that for which this might we might see less impacts of a prairie drought.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So yes, there are a number of species who their core breeding range would fall outside of the prairie pothole region. So some good examples would be green-winged teal, American widgeon. A lot of them breed in the boreal or in Alaska.
Scaup, and some of the other scoters. I don't know how many people pursue scoters. Some do in certain areas, but certainly scaup as well.
Yeah, so those are the ones that come to mind. Scaup are definitely a boreal-centered species. Many of the sea ducks, like you mentioned, scoters and
merganser specialists are probably not likely to see much of an effect from a prairie drought, right?
That's right. Yeah, and actually, when I was out fishing, we saw a few broods of mergansers on the lakes I was on. So it's like, yep, there are still mergansers out there. If you have a special affinity for them, you're probably okay. But yeah, so the big species that we would expect to be impacted would be blue-winged teal, mallards, gadwall, pintails, northern shovelers. Those are sort of the big prairie breeding species. And then a couple of the diving ducks too, canvasbacks and redheads. Those are the species that we would expect to be most impacted by drought in the prairies.
Yeah. Ringneck duck is one that we left off the list. They're going to be mostly tied to the boreal forest as well. And that's a species that has actually, by all accounts, been on the increase, right?
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I know they're an important species for some of the folks in southern latitudes, especially places like Florida has some traditions for ringneck ducks. So yeah, so all hope is not lost. There will even of the impacted species, there will still be some of those out there. But yeah, for those prairie dabblers and the two prairie divers, those will be the ones where, yep, you'll still see some birds, probably not many young birds, and populations may be lower than we've been used to over the past couple decades.
Now, Scott, you mentioned blue-winged teal as a prairie nesting species that is certainly going to feel the effects of this drought. There are a couple of these species that are really closely tied to the prairie. Gadwall and blue-winged teal are probably at the top of that list. Pintails, you can even say, hey, there's a good chunk of that population that'll go north into Alaska, or that does every year go north into Alaska, but blue-winged teal and gadwall are strongly associated with the prairie. So those might be a species that we would look to, for some more immediate effects. Although I will recall here that Mike Zemansky reported some rather unusually high gadwall numbers in North Dakota, if I remember correctly. Now, there are later nesting species among the dabblers, so maybe there's something going on there as well. But getting back to the blue-winged teal, I know that you are a blue-winged teal aficionado, hunting aficionado. And so that's going to be the species that you are really targeting here at the 1st of September. How are you preparing yourself, your mindset going into this hunting season? And I ask this question because, maybe it will help some of the hunters listening to this think about it also, how they might prepare themselves for what they could encounter.
Yeah, good question. They are one of my favorite species, and a species that I focus on early here. So yeah, I've been thinking about that. One of the traditional areas that I go has some small pothole wetlands that there's usually production of blue wings on. Probably won't be much of that, but there's also some larger wetlands associated with some bigger water, a lake system that has some marshes around it that I suspect there will still be water there. That area tends to stage migrating birds that are coming through. In a typical year, there are usually more males there. They're kind of ahead of the migration of the rest of the birds because they've molted and are ready to move south first. So, I would expect to still find male blue wings and maybe a few more female blue wings because they may have not had as strong a nesting effort and went off to molt on their own too. So, yeah. So, I will definitely be checking conditions. From my perspective, hunting blue wings is all about finding shallow water that has the food they're looking for. And with these kind of drought conditions, that changes and shifts and moves around the landscape. But I suspect I'll still be able to find some spots with shallow water that will attract the blue wings that we have.
I would imagine that every year as you're harvesting blue wings, you're checking the age and sex of the bird based on those wing characteristics. And I certainly imagine you're going to be doing so this year. And you're going to be looking for a couple of things, one of which you've already kind of referenced is the male-female kind of ratio. Traditionally, those males are going to be some of the first to go south. If in your harvest, you start out with sort of an equal percentage or higher than normal percentage of females in the bag. Are you going to be tempted to interpret that as I think you kind of intimated there, where maybe that's an indication of lower nesting effort on the part of blue wings?
Yeah, I would expect that's the case. I mean, I would expect that's probably going to be the case for, all of those dabbling ducks that we talked about, mallards, pintails, shovelers, gadwall. The conditions were just not great for them to have a strong nesting effort. So, they maybe tried to nest once if they found adequate conditions, and then they'll probably call it good and say, okay, time to molt. No use investing a bunch of time and energy during conditions which are less than ideal, and prospects for pulling off a successful brood are not very good. So yeah, I mean, birds are making decisions like that. We call it life history trade-offs, but they're making those kind of decisions, as they assess conditions and decide where they invest their time and energy. And so we would expect females to have not put a great effort into reproduction and kind of opted to more move to molting and getting ready for migration and trying to survive. And, probably the implications are that summer survival rate may be higher because, females are most at risk when they're on the nest, and probably they spent less time on nest this year. So that's the one silver lining to poorer conditions is female survival in the summer tends to be higher.
We'll move on here in our conversation, Scott, but I do look forward to connecting with you in early September. That's when we will resume our next season of the Ducks Unlimited podcast and checking on conditions or what you're seeing in terms of number of birds and the composition of the birds that you're harvesting or that you're seeing. Will be another sort of checkpoint. At this juncture, I think we've covered it pretty well in trying to prepare people for what to expect out of at least out of the mid-continent this year in terms of low production out of the prairies and perhaps some continued stable production out of the boreal forest. But yeah, we'll continue on into the fall with some follow-up conversations. Actually, do some touch points there on what it is that you're seeing. I wanted to move on now for a quick discussion about an issue or sort of a question that was raised by one of our listeners here recently. I was contacted by someone who had heard one of our prior episodes related to the drought, and they made the interesting inquiry about essentially asking why we, meaning Ducks Unlimited and the conservation sort of community, don't invest more into intensive management of breeding habitats, breeding habitats. I think mainly the question was in regard to wetlands, the idea being that, hey, when we look at habitats to support migrating and wintering waterfowl, we spend a lot of resources and time on managing the vegetation communities and then providing water on those vegetation communities in those wetlands to provide the habitat at times and places when waterfowl, migrating and wintering waterfowl, need them. And so the question is, why don't we do the same for breeding waterfowl? We know they require wetlands, and we know a lot about the type of wetlands they require. And so I replied and said, that's actually a really good question. And it relates to some of the very early thinking of our pioneering waterfowl biologists and waterfowl managers, and even Ducks Unlimited, when we thought about some of our early conservation projects, I think we actually attempted some of that stuff. So talk about that a little bit, if you could, Scott, in the way we originally thought about how we might, I guess you could even say, drought-proof the prairies to ensure that the effect of drought is minimized, but then what we realized in terms of the reality of the effectiveness of those type of approaches.
Yeah, no, it is a good question. And, especially if the context that most folks have is living in a migration or wintering area, you would think, well, yeah, like we manage the wetlands here. We put water on when we need it. And when it's not supplied by nature, why don't we do that on breeding areas? So I think it is a good question. The short one-word answer to that, why we're not able to do that, would be territoriality. So when the birds are on breeding areas, they're behaving territorially, and they won't tolerate a pair of the same species on a given wetland. So, that means they're spaced out, they're spread out, with a pair of each species on each of the small wetlands scattered around the landscape. And, during the non-breeding period, that territoriality goes away and the birds congregate, and you can pack, thousands or tens of thousands birds into small spaces when you provide the right conditions and food. So it's really that, that behavioral characteristics that changes when they get to the breeding season and they're defending territory and resources for the female to take advantage of, that isn't present during the rest of the year. So a logical question, but that's the simple answer, is the birds just won't tolerate being packed in together during the breeding season. So, if we needed to pump water, say, into 100 wetlands across, a property that we own, it's just not feasible or cost effective to do that. And so the scale of impact, or the number of birds that you can impact, is pretty reduced by just those biological characteristics that the birds have.
Now, Scott, weren't some of DU's earliest and maybe very first, as the best example, conservation projects kind of designed to ensure some of these big wetlands don't go dry? Big grass marsh is the first DU project. It's the one that I'm kind of thinking of, maybe using as an example. Is my memory correct on that? And that, we were thinking, let's figure out a way to keep some of these big wetlands from going dry, but then we learned that maybe it's not those big wetlands that are most important for breeding waterfowl.
Yeah, that's right. So, it's more efficient, I guess, to, put the water control managing ability on bigger wetlands. You put in a levee system or a water control structure, and you can back water up, and, you can do that over large wetland areas. And we did a bunch of those investments early on. There are a whole series of projects like Big Grass Marsh. There are a whole number of them scattered across Saskatchewan and Alberta and Manitoba that were big wetland projects like that. They did provide some of the only habitat to remain during drought periods like we're having now. But it turns out that because of that territoriality issue, they're just not, you still can't pack a bunch of birds into those areas to breed, even though there's a lot of water there. So, they do provide some habitat, and some breeding will happen around those, but it just wasn't something that really worked at scale. And we recognized that and said, well, it's important to have those staging marshes, but that's not really the limiting factor that we have for birds. So, the focus shifted to protecting and restoring those small wetland basins that, may only be, half an acre, or, you could throw a rock across many of these wetlands and hit the other side. They're small. So those are the ones that we focus on now. But yeah, there was a time in our history when we thought about drought proofing the prairies. We just came to the conclusion that that was not a real feasible strategy and not one that was having the desired outcomes. And so, a while ago, we moved away from that approach.
Scott, I'm going to ask you a question that I have gotten occasionally. I want to see how you answer it. I suspect it's similar to what I would say, but it relates to what it is that you were just talking about, where we're seeing a drought right now, or whether populations are really high or whether populations are really low. Those types of sort of unusual circumstances oftentimes prompt questions from people like, oh, well, y'all must be really busy right now. What are y'all doing differently to address this particular current concern? And the fact of the modern, or right now, we'd be talking about the drought. Do you have anybody that has asked you that, like, oh, y'all must be kind of scrambling given the drought that's unfolding? And so how do you respond to that? I guess the general nature of the question would be, do the type of decisions and conservation actions that we take right now differ because we're going through a drought at the moment?
Yeah, I would say not really. We would view the projects that we'd be targeting the same now as we would if it was super wet on the prairies, because we have tools that tell us, for any tract of land that we're looking at or talking with a producer about, restoring or just protecting, we're able to see the number of wetland basins on that. We have historic imagery that we can see when they're full and how many acres there are. And, our tools point us to targeting those kind of areas. So, it's not like our targeting changes with the environmental conditions if it's dry or if it's wet. We're focused on those areas that, when we have the right environmental conditions, they will provide really good habitat. Lots of wetland basins, ideally lots of grassland cover across the whole, upland portions of the habitat there. That's what we're focusing on. So, the work on that continues even if those basins happen to be dry and they may not be producing waterfowl this year. Many of the investments that we make are sort of perpetual investments where we purchase a conservation easement or buy a property and do restorations and sell it back onto the market with an easement attached. So we know that habitat will be there sort of forever. And so we can think about those investments in the longer term. And, we're not just targeting which areas have wetlands this year. We know that areas that have high wetland density, those are going to be good when we do have water. And when things are dry, it's hard to sort of compensate for those broad scale environmental conditions.
One thing that I'll add to that I try to remember to incorporate in my response to a question of that nature is to say that there are a couple of reasons, two big reasons why a wetland or wetland basin can go dry. One is environmental variation, environmental change, such as a drought, lack of precipitation over an extended period of time, and that causes a wetland basin to go dry. And we've talked ad nauseum here on previous podcasts about, and will in the future as well, about the value of that wet-dry cycle for rejuvenating the productivity of wetlands. The other thing that can cause a wetland basin to go dry is some type of drainage of that wetland.
Right.
And the long-term effects of those two causes of a dry wetland basin are are vastly different. We're not so concerned about the short-term environmentally driven drying of a wetland because it's part of the cycle and it's part of the necessary rejuvenation of that wetland. What we are really concerned about and what our conservation actions are designed to combat is that permanent drying through some type of drainage activity. That's really where we focus. Is that a good way of putting it?
Yeah, no, that's exactly accurate. If it's drained, it doesn't matter how much precipitation we have. That basin's not gonna hold water, not gonna provide the biodiversity benefits and all the other benefits like flood storage and carbon sequestration and removing nutrients. None of those things happen when it's drained. So that is the focus, is maintaining the integrity of the wetland basin itself and trying to provide the associated upland cover. And then we kind of let the environmental conditions fluctuate as they may. And, duck populations have been able to respond to those fluctuating environmental conditions for a long time. And we remain confident that if we maintain that habitat base, that ability to respond to those conditions will continue into the future.
We'll move on here in the conversation, and I'll just say that we'll continue to keep an eye on precipitation as it unfolds here over the remaining months of this year and into next year, because that's right now, looking forward, is when we start to think about how wetland conditions may develop for the breeding season of next year. We've talked previously with you, Scott, about the different pieces of the equation or of the formula that have to be in place in order to produce abundant wetlands in the spring to benefit breeding waterfowl. And now is the time that we start to think about. We start to think about that. So we'll stay in touch with you on those issues and update people as those situations develop. I guess the good news is that we've had wetlands, a large percentage of the wetlands in the prairies go through this drying phase this summer. And as I spoke with Pat Kehoe, he said, I think I asked the question, have they been dry long enough? And I think the answer at this point is, yeah, if you get one good drying, even over the course of a summer, if we get water on them next year, that's going to be enough. Or the amount of drying that we've seen this summer is going to be enough to rejuvenate them once we get precipitation and get rainfall back in those basins. So,
right.
Before we let you go, again, we're here mid-July, July 12th. I wanted to check in with you, see if you could give us an update on the border. I know it feels like things are changing daily or weekly with regard to. I know that monthly is sort of the milepost. There's like a date every month where there's a new announcement made. But give us an understanding of where things are with the border, and if you're so bold, kind of handicap for us what we might expect in terms of the border later this year. So
the border closure associated with the COVID pandemic here in Canada has really been driven by, our progress on vaccination rates here in Canada. We were a bit behind getting vaccination started. Supply was pretty low. We don't have any domestic production. So we were kind of waiting on vaccine to come from Europe, and some of the more recent shipments came from the US after you guys were kind of caught up and everybody who wanted vaccine had a chance to get it. So that has improved. We've thought that that's been a precursor to the border opening. And I know here across Canada, I think we're above 75% of people having one dose of vaccine. And I know at least here in Manitoba, we were pushing 50% of the population having two doses. So that number was increasing. We're probably getting to the point where anyone who is interested in vaccine will have access to it. We'll probably reach the point where supply exceeds demand. So that's positive. There have started to have been some discussions about border reopening. For example, they had relaxed restrictions for Canadian citizens and permanent residents who had left the country and were coming back. If you're fully vaccinated now, you can forego the 2-week quarantine that was required if you could come back with a negative test in hand, and then you take a test at the border. And if that test is negative, then basically you don't have to sequester yourself away for 2 weeks once you get back. So my guess is that if we continue to see vaccinations roll out here, maybe they may even make an announcement that the date that they renew that border closure or not is around the 21st. So the current one, I think, expires July 21st. They may make some announcements about, what's coming on that here as we get close to the one in July. I think, for folks interested in coming up in the fall and hunting, I think the odds are pretty good that the border will be open for fully vaccinated folks by sometime in September. I won't speculate as to whether that will be, come September 1, you'll be able to come in. But I would give even better odds that, for sure by October, I think folks will likely be able to enter Canada for, what had been deemed non-essential things like tourism and hunting. So, probably many of us would characterize those activities as essential. But in the context of the pandemic, they were classified as non-essential. So I think it looks pretty good right now that, that the border will be opening, could even happen in August. So, I'm pretty optimistic that's going to happen sometime here in the next month or two.
One of the things I've heard, Scott, regardless of when the date is that we should expect some type of a proof of vaccination to be a criterion for entry. Is that what you're hearing, or is that? And I don't know how much they're even sharing, but obviously I know there's a lot of scuttlebutt that's occurring pretty much everywhere. Are you hearing the same thing, that would be a reasonable expectation that even once it is open, there would be some criterion for showing proof of vaccination to enter Canada?
Yes, I think that definitely will be the case. And probably a good measure of that is just what they have in place right now that they've already changed for Canadian citizens and permanent residents. So right now, if you can provide documentation of being fully vaccinated, just what I described earlier, you show up at the border with a negative test, you take one right there. And then if that one is negative, you're good to go. You don't have to quarantine. So, exactly what that proof of vaccination looks like, for folks in the US, I suspect that's just the vaccination card the CDC gave you and had your 2 doses on it. I suspect that'll suffice. I know here in Manitoba, we got, if you've been fully vaccinated, you were able to get a QR code, sort of an electronic signature that documents your vaccination. Those will definitely qualify. But yeah, I think that's reasonable to assume, that's the requirement they've instituted for Canadian citizens. So any visitors that were coming in will probably need to meet that same requirement once the borders open.
Well, we continue to live in an interesting time, don't we?
Yeah, that's right.
Scott, I appreciate you being willing to share with us sort of an update on that front. I know it's of interest to a lot of people, and yeah, we'll continue to check back in. And like I said a little while ago, you will be one of our first guests once we get back into season 5, starting in September. We want to check in and see how your hunting exploits are going and what you're seeing in terms of the composition of your bag as you're out pursuing blue wings. So any other parting words from you, Scott? Appreciate all your help over the summer, but anything else to add?
No, I don't think so. I look forward to fall arriving and being able to report on, the exploits out there in the field and seeing birds again over decoys. So I am definitely counting days till that happens, and happy to collect a little data along the way to report back on.
I'm sure you are. We appreciate you being willing to do so. Scott, thanks for your time today. Look forward to talking with you again in the future.
You bet. Thanks, Mike.
A special thanks to our guest on today's episode, Dr. Scott Stevens with Ducks Unlimited Canada. We appreciate his continued engagement with us here on the Ducks Unlimited podcast and giving us a view of the way things are unfolding up on the prairies, and look forward to connecting with him again as we get into the fall season of the Ducks Unlimited podcast. As always, we thank our producer, Clay Baird, for the great work that he does, and we thank you, the listener, for joining us, and we thank you for your support of wetlands conservation.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the DU Podcast. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the show and visit www.ducks.org/DU Podcast for resources based on today's topics, as well as access to more episodes. Opinions expressed by guests do not necessarily reflect those of Ducks Unlimited. Until next time, stay tuned to the Ducks.